3 years had passed since Ryan Mitchell inherited $90 billion and watched his ex-wife, Victoria, marry the best friend who had betrayed him. But the anonymous email that arrived at 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday would shatter the careful peace he'd built and reveal that his mother's secret empire contained one final layer, a hidden trust worth $47 billion that Eleanor had established for a purpose Ryan never imagined, controlled by a board of 7 people who'd been manipulating global markets for decades. And now they wanted Ryan to join them or face consequences that would destroy everything he'd built. Victoria's new startup, funded by mysterious investors she refused to name, had just secured a $90 million Series B round, but the lead investor was someone from the shadow board who viewed Victoria as leverage against Ryan. And Derek's sudden promotion to managing partner at Boston's most prestigious law firm came with strings attached to the same powerful people who controlled his mother's hidden trust. When Ryan opened the encrypted email and saw photographs of his mother meeting with world leaders, tech billionaires, and intelligence officials in locations that weren't supposed to exist, accompanied by a message that read, "Your mother's real work begins now. The libraries were just cover for something bigger," he realized that the $90 billion inheritance he'd spent 3 years learning to manage was nothing compared to the true empire Eleanor had built in absolute secrecy. What was his mother really doing during those nights she claimed to be managing real estate deals? Who were the 6 other board members controlling the hidden trust? And why did they need Ryan specifically to activate powers his mother had locked behind biometric authentication only his DNA could unlock? And what would Ryan do when he discovered that Victoria and Derek's betrayal 3 years ago wasn't random chance, but a carefully orchestrated test designed by the shadow board to measure whether Ryan possessed the ruthlessness they required? A test he'd apparently failed by choosing mercy over revenge. But now they were giving him one more opportunity to prove he deserved his mother's complete legacy. And this time the stakes involved not millions or billions, but the stability of governments, the future of technologies that could reshape humanity, and secrets that powerful people would kill to protect. Ryan Mitchell stared at his laptop screen in the darkness of his home office, reading the encrypted email for the 4th time. But the words didn't become less impossible with repetition. "Mr. Mitchell, you've spent 3 years managing what you believe is your complete inheritance, but your mother's $90 billion real estate empire represents approximately 67% of her actual estate. The remaining 33%, $47 billion in liquid assets, strategic investments, and proprietary technologies, has been held in trust awaiting your readiness. The Eclipse Trust, established by your mother in 1987, serves purposes beyond wealth accumulation. Eleanor Mitchell was more than a real estate investor. She was the architect of systems, a guardian of technologies, and a participant in arrangements that ensure global stability through methods democratic governments cannot publicly acknowledge. The trust requires unanimous board approval to release assets to designated heirs. 6 of 7 board members have voted. You are the 7th, but you cannot vote until you've been fully briefed and have demonstrated the necessary qualities. Your mother designed tests to measure those qualities. Your response to Victoria's betrayal was monitored closely. Your choice of mercy over revenge was noted. But opinions differ on whether that choice demonstrated wisdom or weakness. This message serves as invitation to discover the truth about your mother's work and to claim what she built for you, if you're capable. Attached are photographs from your mother's private archive. Study them carefully. Then decide whether you want to know more or prefer to remain comfortable with incomplete truth. The choice, as always, is yours. The Eclipse Trust Board. Ryan opened the first attachment and his breath caught in his throat. The photograph showed his mother, younger, maybe 40 years old, standing in what looked like a secure government facility. She wore a visitor badge identifying her as Dr. E.R. Cross, Special Technology Consultant. But she was shaking hands with a man Ryan recognized from history books, a former CIA director who'd served under 3 presidents. The timestamp on the photo was 2007, a year Ryan remembered clearly because his mother had told him she was attending a library technology conference in Washington, D.C. The second photograph showed Eleanor in a laboratory, examining what appeared to be advanced computing equipment that looked decades ahead of what should have existed in 2003, when the image was dated. Scientists in the background wore badges from organizations Ryan had never heard of: Prometheus Research Institute, Kronos Development Group, Atlas Security Systems. The third photograph made Ryan's hands shake, his mother sitting at a conference table with tech billionaires whose companies now dominated global markets. But the meeting was dated 1999, years before several of those companies officially existed. They were reviewing documents labeled Strategic Market Positioning, Controlled Innovation Release, and Timeline Management. 47 more photographs followed, each one revealing a dimension of his mother's life Ryan had never imagined. Eleanor Mitchell meeting with defense contractors, pharmaceutical executives, aerospace engineers, quantum computing researchers. Eleanor touring facilities that didn't appear on any maps. Eleanor reviewing documents classified at levels Ryan didn't know existed. But the final photograph stopped Ryan's heart entirely. His mother standing beside a younger version of Victoria's father, Jonathan Reeves, in what the timestamp indicated was 2008, 7 years before Ryan met Victoria at a mutual friend's party. They were reviewing a document whose header Ryan could just barely read. Subject Compatibility Assessment, Ryan Mitchell and Victoria Reeves. Ryan grabbed his phone, hand trembling, but before he could call anyone, a second email arrived. Don't call Lawrence Chen, Mr. Pemberton, or any member of your E.R. Cross Holdings executive team. They know nothing about Eclipse Trust. Your mother compartmentalized ruthlessly. Yes, your meeting with Victoria was arranged. No, she didn't know. Her father facilitated circumstances. Biology and psychology handled the rest. Your mother wanted to observe your relationship development under controlled conditions. Yes, Derek Morrison's friendship with you was also cultivated, though he genuinely liked you initially, before his character defects manifested predictably. Everything you've experienced for the past decade was observed, measured, analyzed. Your mother was brilliant, but she was also strategic to a degree you're only beginning to comprehend. If you want answers, go to your mother's hidden office, the bookshelf section that opened to reveal her E.R. Cross workspace. There's another hidden door behind the desk inside that room. Your biometrics will unlock it. Inside, you'll find documentation explaining Eclipse Trust's purpose and your role in its future. Or don't investigate. Continue managing your $90 billion real estate portfolio. Live your comfortable life with Elena and accept that some truths remain buried. We'll find another candidate eventually, but your mother spent 40 years preparing you for this moment, Ryan. She believed you were capable of understanding and accepting her complete legacy. She believed you inherited not just her wealth, but her vision for what wealth and power could achieve when wielded by someone with genuine principles. Prove her right, or prove that mercy was weakness and her assessment of you was fundamentally flawed. You have 72 hours to decide. Ryan sat in darkness for 20 minutes, his mind spinning through implications. His entire adult life, his meeting Victoria, his friendship with Derek, his marriage, his betrayal, his inheritance, all of it had been observed, maybe even orchestrated, by people working with his mother toward purposes he couldn't begin to guess. The fury he'd thought he'd resolved about Victoria's affair returned with new intensity. but it was directed at his mother now. How dare she manipulate his life? How dare she treat his relationships as experiments? How dare she die without explaining any of this, leaving him to discover it through cryptic emails from anonymous boards? But beneath the anger, Ryan felt something else. Curiosity, the same hunger for knowledge that had drawn him to library. Science that made him value education and learning above almost everything else. His mother had been involved in something significant enough to require absolute secrecy, something that connected real estate billions to government intelligence, to technological development, to global market manipulation. Whatever Eclipse Trust was, it mattered enough that his mother had spent 40 years building it, while simultaneously building the real estate empire. She'd lived not a double life, but a triple life. Eleanor Mitchell, the librarian, E.R. Cross, the real estate mogul, and someone else entirely. Someone who met with intelligence directors and tech billionaires and reviewed compatibility assessments for her son's romantic relationships. Ryan stood, grabbed his jacket, and drove to his childhood home, the modest Cape Cod house he'd kept despite offers from developers to buy the property for millions. The house where his mother had raised him, where she'd maintained her secret office, where apparently she'd maintained even deeper secrets. The house was quiet at 4 a.m., but Ryan moved through familiar rooms with new awareness. Every memory was now suspect, every conversation potentially calculated, every moment of his childhood possibly part of some larger design. He entered his mother's first hidden office, the room behind the bookshelf where he'd discovered E.R. Cross Holdings 3 years ago. The space was exactly as he'd left it. Monitors, filing cabinets, photographs of his mother with world leaders and business titans. But now Ryan noticed details he'd overlooked before, the way the desk was positioned slightly away from the wall, creating a gap that seemed unnecessary for a room this size. Ryan moved behind the desk and found what he was looking for, a small biometric scanner embedded in the wall, nearly invisible against the dark wood paneling. He pressed his thumb against it, feeling foolish, but the panel clicked and swung inward, revealing a staircase descending into darkness. Lights activated automatically as Ryan descended 15 steps into a basement level that shouldn't exist based on the house's blueprints. The space below was larger than the office above, a true command center with technology that looked like it belonged in a government intelligence facility rather than a suburban Massachusetts home. Multiple workstations lined the walls, each with monitors displaying frozen screens showing maps, financial data, technical schematics, and communications logs. A conference table occupied the center of the room, surrounded by 7 chairs, each with a nameplate. 6 of the nameplates showed initials: MT, JZ, DO, PW, RK, and LC. The 7th nameplate read simply, Ryan Mitchell, pending. Ryan recognized the first 5 sets of initials immediately: Marcus Thompson, Jennifer Zhao, David O'Brien, Patricia Washington, Raymond Kim. His mother's executive team at E.R. Cross Holdings weren't just managing the real estate empire. They were board members of Eclipse Trust. The 6th set of initials, LC, could only be Lawrence Chen, his attorney. They'd all lied to him. For 3 years, they'd pretended the real estate portfolio was his complete inheritance, while knowing about this hidden trust, this shadow organization, this entire second empire his mother had built. Ryan felt betrayal surge fresh and hot, but he forced himself to think strategically. They'd lied because his mother had instructed them to lie. They'd waited because someone, his mother, the board, whoever controlled Eclipse Trust, had decided Ryan needed 3 years managing the visible empire before learning about the hidden one. A large screen on the main wall activated suddenly, and a woman's face appeared. Severe features, gray hair pulled back severely, eyes that suggested she'd seen more than most people could imagine. She spoke with British accent refined by decades of international work. "Mr. Mitchell, I am Dr. Margaret Sterling, Director of Eclipse Trust Operations and your mother's partner for 38 years. If you're seeing this recording, you've passed the first threshold, choosing curiosity over comfort. What follows will challenge everything you believe about your mother, yourself, and the world you think you understand." She paused, her expression softening marginally. "Eleanor loved you more than any mission, any goal, any objective we ever pursued. Remember that as you learn truths that may make you question her choices, every decision she made prioritized your well-being and your future, even when those decisions required deception or manipulation. She was a mother first, always, but she was also a guardian of systems that billions of people depend upon without ever knowing those systems exist." The screen shifted to show documents, timelines, organizational charts, information Ryan struggled to process at 4 a.m. after discovering his life had been orchestrated by people he'd never met. Eclipse Trust was established in 1987 by 7 individuals who recognized that democratic governments, while preferable to alternatives, move too slowly to address certain threats and opportunities. Dr. Sterling's voiceover continued as images appeared showing wars, economic crashes, technological breakthroughs, and political upheavals. "We identify emerging risks: economic collapse, technological disruption, geopolitical instability, and we intervene through market influence, strategic investments, and occasionally direct action to prevent catastrophic outcomes." The screen showed a timeline of events from 1987 to present, with Eclipse Trust interventions marked in red. The 2008 financial crisis, softened by strategic market purchases that prevented total collapse. The dot-com bubble of 2000, managed through coordinated sell-offs that reduced severity. Multiple regional conflicts shortened or prevented through carefully applied economic pressure and technological advantages given to specific factions. "Your mother's role was threefold," Dr. Sterling explained as Eleanor's photograph appeared. "First, she built the real estate empire you now manage, creating stable long-term assets that generate reliable income funding Eclipse operations. Second, she identified and cultivated relationships with key players in technology, government, and finance, relationships you've now inherited through her network. Third, she developed methodologies for measuring psychological fitness and strategic thinking, qualities we require in board members who make decisions affecting billions of people." Ryan's photograph appeared alongside his mother's, but it was annotated with disturbing detail. Psychological assessments, decision-making analyses, relationship patterns, moral reasoning evaluations. Someone had been documenting and studying him for decades, measuring his responses to situations both natural and artificially created. The situation with Victoria Reeves and Derek Morrison was partly organic, partly encouraged, Dr. Sterling said, and Ryan's anger reignited. "We didn't create Victoria's ambition or Derek's character defects, but we did create opportunities for those qualities to manifest. Your mother needed to observe how you'd respond to betrayal when you believed you had nothing. Would you seek revenge, accept defeat, or choose a middle path demonstrating both strength and wisdom? Your response indicated emotional maturity and principled decision-making, qualities we value." The screen shifted again, showing Victoria and Derek in various locations over the past 3 years: restaurants, offices, their apartment. Ryan realized with cold certainty that Eclipse Trust had been monitoring them even after the divorce, tracking their lives, measuring their struggles. "But the test had a second phase you're only now discovering," Dr. Sterling continued. "How would you respond to learning that your betrayal was observed, measured, possibly facilitated by the very people you're learning to trust? Would you feel violated and withdraw? Would you rage against manipulation? Or would you seek to understand context and purpose before rendering judgment? The screen went dark except for Dr. Sterling's face, and her expression was grave. Your mother believed you'd choose understanding, Ryan. She believed she'd raised you to recognize that good people sometimes do questionable things for defensible reasons. She believed you'd inherited not just her wealth, but her capacity for strategic thinking that prioritizes long-term outcomes over short-term emotional satisfaction. Ryan stood in the basement command center, surrounded by evidence of his mother's secret life, and felt tears burning his eyes, frustration, anger, grief, but also reluctant understanding. His mother had been trying to prepare him for something, had been testing him, measuring him, molding him into someone capable of wielding power responsibly. But the cost of that preparation had been his autonomy, his privacy, his ability to trust that his relationships were genuine rather than engineered. The woman he'd loved had been vetted by compatibility assessments. His betrayal had been observed like a laboratory experiment. His entire adult life had been a proving ground for membership in an organization he'd never heard of until tonight. The Eclipse Trust Board meets in 72 hours, Dr. Sterling said, as the video concluded. Location and access codes are in the files on Workstation 3. Attendance is optional but recommended if you want answers to questions that are surely overwhelming you. Your mother's complete files are available now. Every mission, every decision, every intervention she participated in over 40 years. Study them, judge her work, decide whether you want to continue what she built or walk away with the $90 billion you already have. The screen went dark, and Ryan was alone in his mother's hidden command center, surrounded by secrets that transformed everything he thought he knew about his life, his mother, and his purpose. Part 2. The shadow board. Ryan spent the next 70 hours reading through his mother's files, but each document raised more questions than it answered. Eleanor Mitchell, E.R. Cross, had been involved in operations spanning 4 decades and 6 continents. She'd helped prevent economic collapses, facilitated technology transfers that accelerated human development, and occasionally made decisions that prioritized stability over democracy in ways that made Ryan deeply uncomfortable. In 1994, Eclipse Trust had orchestrated the quiet removal of a democratically elected leader in Southeast Asia, whose policies would have destabilized regional markets and triggered conflicts that could have killed millions. They'd replaced him with a coalition government that was less democratic but more stable, averting catastrophe but violating principles Ryan held sacred. In 2001, Eclipse Trust had possessed advanced knowledge of terrorist plots but had chosen not to share that intelligence with public authorities because doing so would have exposed their intelligence networks and compromised future operations. They'd mitigated the attacks through indirect interventions, anonymous tips, security enhancement recommendations, strategic warnings delivered through intermediaries, but they hadn't prevented them entirely. In 2015, Eclipse Trust had deliberately crashed the stock price of a pharmaceutical company developing treatments they deemed too dangerous for public release, destroying billions in shareholder value, but preventing technologies they believed humanity wasn't ready to handle responsibly. Every decision had justifications. Every intervention had reasoning, but the cumulative weight of his mother's secret work felt crushing. She'd been playing God with global systems while teaching Ryan about kindness and integrity and democratic values. The contradictions were staggering, but what haunted Ryan most were the personal files. His mother had documented her reasoning for every choice she'd made about his upbringing, and reading her private journals was like hearing her voice from beyond the grave. Ryan turned 7 today, Thomas has been dead 2 years, and I see my son struggling to understand death, impermanence, loss. I could ease that pain with wealth, distraction, comfort, endless entertainment. But pain builds character in ways comfort never does. I choose to let him grieve authentically, to struggle with difficult emotions, to develop resilience through adversity, rather than avoidance. He'll hate this choice someday when he learns I could have made his childhood easier. I accept that hatred as the price of raising a son capable of carrying what I'm building. Ryan is 16 and struggling in school, not academically but socially. He doesn't fit with the popular kids, doesn't understand the social hierarchies and cruel competitions that characterize high school. I could intervene, private school, tutors, moving to a better district. But I watch him find his people in the library, in the debate club, among the students who value substance over status. These relationships will define his character more than anything I could orchestrate. I choose to let him navigate social complexity alone, even when it hurts to watch him struggle. Ryan met a girl named Victoria Reeves tonight at a party Jennifer's daughter hosted. Jonathan Reeves's daughter, ambitious, beautiful, driven. The compatibility assessments suggest 67% probability of relationship formation, 89% probability of eventual betrayal if circumstances change. Perfect. I need Ryan to experience real heartbreak, genuine betrayal, to test whether kindness survives disillusionment. I hate using my son this way, but Eclipse needs board members who've been tested in fire, not just taught abstract principles. I'm creating the circumstances that will either forge him into someone capable of this work or prove he's better off without it. Either outcome honors him, one by bringing him into the work I've built, one by protecting him from burdens he shouldn't carry. Ryan closed the journal, his hands shaking with emotions he couldn't name. His mother had known Victoria would betray him. She'd known Derek would corrupt over time. She'd watched Ryan's relationships deteriorate while having the power to prevent it, but choosing not to intervene because his suffering served her larger purposes. The love was evident in every entry. Eleanor Mitchell had adored her son, had sacrificed comfort and recognition to give him normal childhood, had agonized over every decision that caused him pain. But the manipulation was also undeniable. She'd treated his life as a proving ground, his relationships as experiments, his suffering as necessary for his development into someone capable of wielding the power she was preparing to give him. Ryan wanted to hate her, but he couldn't. He wanted to forgive her, but he couldn't do that either. What he felt was something more complex. Recognition that his mother had been trying to prepare him for something extraordinary, while also acknowledging that her methods were ethically questionable at best, monstrously manipulative at worst. The Eclipse Trust meeting was scheduled for Thursday evening at a location in New York City, a private floor of a building Ryan recognized from his real estate portfolio. Of course, the trust would meet in a building he technically owned but hadn't known served purposes beyond commercial leasing. Ryan almost didn't go, but curiosity won over resentment. He needed to see these people, the 5 executives he'd trusted for 3 years, the attorney who'd guided him through divorce, the mysterious Dr. Sterling who'd narrated his mother's confessional video. He needed to look them in the eyes and decide whether they were allies continuing his mother's important work or manipulators who'd treated him as a project rather than a person. The flight to New York was turbulent, but Ryan's thoughts were more chaotic than the weather. He kept thinking about Victoria and Derek, about how his mother had arranged their meeting, facilitated circumstances, predicted betrayal with statistical precision. Their relationship, his marriage, his divorce, all of it had been observed, measured, analyzed by people who viewed human connection as data rather than sacred. But he also thought about the interventions Eclipse Trust had made, prevented economic collapses, averted wars, managed technological development to prevent catastrophic misuse. If his mother's files were accurate, the organization had saved millions of lives through strategic manipulation of markets and governments and technologies. Did the ends justify the means? That was the question Ryan grappled with as his plane descended into LaGuardia. Could he accept that his mother's manipulation of his life had been justified by the larger purpose she served? Could he forgive violations of his autonomy because those violations had allegedly prepared him for work that mattered on global scales? Ryan didn't have answers, but he had questions that demanded asking. Part 3. The Reckoning. The Eclipse Trust meeting room occupied the entire 48th floor of the Meridian Tower in Manhattan, but security to access it was unlike anything Ryan had experienced. Biometric scans at the street entrance, identity verification by guards who were clearly former military or intelligence, elevator that required both keycard and fingerprint authentication, and finally a man-trap entry system that scanned for weapons, recording devices, and electronic transmitters. By the time Ryan entered the actual meeting space, he felt like he was accessing a government black site rather than attending a board meeting. The 5 executives from Cross Holdings were already present, sitting in the same positions their nameplates indicated: Marcus Thompson, Jennifer Zhao, David O'Brien, Patricia Washington, and Raymond Kim. They looked exactly as Ryan knew them: professional, competent, supremely confident in their expertise. But now he saw them differently, not just as managers of his real estate empire, but as members of a shadow organization that manipulated global systems. Lawrence Chen sat in the 6th seat, and his expression when he saw Ryan was carefully neutral, but Ryan detected discomfort beneath the professional facade. His attorney, the man who'd guided him through divorce, who'd represented his interests, who'd supposedly been his advocate, had been Eclipse Trust all along. The 7th chair, the one with Ryan's nameplate, remained empty as he stood in the doorway, unsure whether to enter or leave. "Ryan," Jennifer Zhao said gently, standing and gesturing to his chair. "Please, we know you have questions, and you deserve answers, but please sit, let us explain." "Explain what?" Ryan's voice was harder than he'd intended, but anger he'd been suppressing for 70 hours surged forward. "Explain how you've been lying to me for 3 years? Explain how my mother treated my life like an experiment? Explain how everything I thought was real was actually orchestrated by people playing God with systems they had no right to control?" Dr. Margaret Sterling entered from a side door, her severe features composed, but her eyes showing what might have been sympathy. She was older than her video had suggested, probably mid-70s, but carried herself with authority that transcended age. "Mr. Mitchell, your anger is understandable and justified. Your mother anticipated it. She left you something. A letter she wrote the week before she died, to be given to you only if you made it this far." She handed Ryan an envelope, cream-colored and heavy, similar to the letter Eleanor had left him 3 years ago, explaining Cross Holdings. Ryan took it but didn't open it immediately, too focused on the people who'd been managing his life without his knowledge. "Who gave you the right?" Ryan demanded, looking at each board member in turn. "Who gave any of you the right to manipulate markets, topple governments, decide which technologies humanity was ready for? You talk about democratic values, but nothing about Eclipse Trust is democratic. You're 7 people making decisions that affect billions, with no oversight, no accountability, no democratic mandate." "You're absolutely right," Marcus Thompson said quietly, and his admission surprised Ryan into silence. "We're not democratic. We're not accountable to public systems. We operate in shadows because democracy, for all its virtues, cannot move quickly enough to address certain threats. We're the undemocratic protection that allows democracy to survive." "That's rationalization," Ryan shot back. "Every authoritarian in history has claimed to protect people from themselves. Every dictator has argued that freedom is dangerous and people need wise elders to make decisions for them. You're not protecting democracy, you're subverting it. Sometimes, Dr. Sterling acknowledged, and her honesty was somehow more disturbing than defensiveness would have been. Sometimes we subvert democratic processes to prevent outcomes we believe would be catastrophic. Sometimes we're right, and our interventions prevent disasters. Sometimes we're wrong, and our interventions create problems worse than the ones we prevented. We're not infallible, Mr. Mitchell. We're just people with enormous resources trying to do work we believe matters. But who checks your power? Ryan pressed. Who stops you when you're wrong? If you operate in complete secrecy with no oversight, what prevents you from becoming exactly the kind of authoritarian threat you claim to prevent? Patricia Washington leaned forward, her expression grave. Your mother asked the same question for 40 years, Ryan. It haunted her. She designed systems to prevent Eclipse Trust from becoming what we opposed. Term limits for board members, mandatory rotation of leadership roles, requirements that any military or coercive action required unanimous consent. But she also recognized that those safeguards were only as good as the people implementing them. That's why selecting board members mattered so much to her. That's why she spent 33 years preparing you to potentially join us. By manipulating my entire life, Ryan said bitterly. By arranging my relationships, observing my betrayals, treating my suffering as data for your psychological assessments. You want to talk about preventing authoritarianism while my own mother treated me like a subject in an experiment I never consented to participate in. Raymond Kim spoke for the first time, his voice quiet but firm. Open the letter, Ryan. Your mother knew you'd feel this way. She knew you'd be angry, violated, betrayed. She knew because she felt the same way when she discovered Eclipse Trust. Ryan looked at the envelope in his hands, then at the 7 board members watching him, with expressions ranging from sympathy to calculation to something that might have been hope. He broke the wax seal and began reading his mother's final words. My dearest Ryan, if you're reading this, you've discovered Eclipse Trust, and you're furiously angry with me. Good. Your anger means you have the moral clarity this work requires, the ability to recognize when power has been abused, even when that abuse comes from people you love, for purposes you might eventually support. I need you to understand something. I didn't want this for you. When your father died and I became a widow with a young son, my plan was to raise you in modest comfort, give you normal childhood, let you choose your own path completely free from the burdens I carried. I wanted you to be happy, Ryan. Just happy. Not wealthy, not powerful, not responsible for systems affecting billions. Just genuinely happy. But then I made a mistake. I told the Eclipse board I wanted to retire, to focus on you exclusively, to step away from work that was consuming my life. They refused. They showed me projections of what would happen without Eclipse interventions, economic collapses, regional wars, technological catastrophes we'd been quietly preventing. They made convincing arguments that my retirement would cost millions of lives. I should have retired anyway. I should have chosen you over the abstract millions. But I didn't, and that choice haunts me. Instead, I compromised. I'd continue Eclipse work, but I'd raise you to potentially succeed me, creating the possibility that you could eventually take my place, and I could retire knowing the work continued with someone I trusted. Absolutely. That decision required treating you differently than I'd originally intended, exposing you to hardship that would build character, creating situations that would test your judgment, observing your development to assess whether you possessed qualities Eclipse required. The Victoria situation was the worst of it. I knew she'd betray you eventually. The compatibility assessments were clear about her character and values. but I facilitated your meeting anyway because I needed to observe how you'd handle genuine heartbreak. I watched you fall in love, get married, try to build a life with someone I knew would ultimately disappoint you, and I did nothing to prevent it because your suffering served my purposes. I can't defend that choice, Ryan. It was monstrous. It prioritized Eclipse Trust's needs over your happiness, and there's no justification that makes that acceptable. I could claim I was protecting billions of people by ensuring Eclipse had competent leadership in the next generation, but that's just rationalization for treating my own son as a means rather than an end in himself. Here's what I can tell you. Everything you're feeling right now, the violation, the betrayal, the sense that your autonomy was stolen, your feelings are completely valid. You didn't consent to being tested. You didn't agree to have your life observed and manipulated. You were entitled to privacy, to authentic relationships, to make mistakes and experience consequences, without everything being measured against some larger purpose. I stole that from you, and I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, but I'm also going to ask you to consider something. Now that you know Eclipse Trust exists, now that you've seen what we do and why we do it, can you walk away? Can you take your $90 billion, live comfortably with Elena, who is genuine, by the way? We had nothing to do with that relationship, and I was so relieved to see you find someone organically. And ignore the work Eclipse does? Maybe you can, maybe you should. Maybe the right choice is to reject everything I built, denounce the manipulation, and prove that you're better than the people who treated you as a project. But maybe you'll decide that the work matters despite the questionable methods. Maybe you'll recognize that Eclipse Trust, for all its flaws, prevents genuine catastrophes through strategic interventions that no democratic government can execute quickly enough. Maybe you'll choose to continue what I started while also reforming it, improving it, making it less authoritarian and more accountable. That choice is entirely yours, Ryan. The board cannot compel you to join. You already have the $90 billion from ER Cross Holdings. The $47 billion in Eclipse Trust assets will be distributed to designated charities if you decline membership. You lose nothing material by walking away, but you gain something by staying, the opportunity to shape Eclipse Trust's future, to reform systems I built, to ensure that the power we wield is used as ethically as possible by someone with genuine principles. I prepared you for this choice not by demanding you make it, but by developing in you the character that would make you capable of making it wisely. You have the intelligence to understand complex systems. You have the empathy to care about how power affects people. You have the integrity to recognize when authority is being abused. And you have the courage to stand up for your principles, even when doing so costs you something precious. Whatever you decide, I love you. I'm proud of the man you've become, despite my manipulation, and I accept full responsibility for every way I violated your trust. While trying to prepare you for work I believed mattered more than comfort or happiness. The board will present you with Eclipse Trust's current projects. Evaluate them honestly. Decide whether the work justifies the methods. Then make your choice, knowing I'll love you regardless. All my love, forever and always, Mom. Ryan read the letter twice, but tears blurred the words by the second reading. His mother had known exactly how he'd feel, had anticipated his arguments, had accepted responsibility while also making a final case for the work she'd devoted 4 decades to completing. He looked up at the board members watching him silently, letting him process without interruption. These people had lied to him, manipulated him, treated his life as data for their assessments. But they'd also prevented economic collapses, averted wars, managed technological development in ways that allegedly saved millions of lives. "Show me," Ryan said quietly, taking his seat at the table for the first time. "Show me Eclipse Trust's current projects. Let me evaluate your work honestly, then I'll decide whether any of this was justified. Dr. Sterling activated the room's presentation systems, and for the next 4 hours, Ryan received a comprehensive briefing on Eclipse Trust's ongoing interventions. Part 4. The Impossible Choices. The projects Eclipse Trust was currently managing were staggering in scope and complexity, but each one forced Ryan to grapple with impossible ethical questions. Project Terminus involved preventing a global financial crisis similar to 2008 but potentially worse, triggered by over-leveraged cryptocurrency markets, failing pension systems, and sovereign debt crises converging simultaneously. Eclipse Trust had positioned assets to absorb the worst shocks, had influenced regulatory frameworks to prevent the most catastrophic outcomes, and had quietly coordinated with central banks to ensure liquidity during the crisis. The intervention would cost Eclipse approximately $8 billion, but would prevent economic collapse that could impoverish hundreds of millions. Ryan's question: isn't preventing market consequences just protecting bad actors from their own mistakes? Don't people learn from crashes? Dr. Sterling's response: some do, but the people who suffer most from crashes aren't the over-leveraged hedge fund managers or reckless speculators. They're working people who lose jobs, pensions, homes. Eclipse absorbs the moral hazard by taking the financial hit ourselves, rather than letting it cascade to populations that didn't create the problem. Project Prometheus involved managing the development and release of advanced artificial intelligence technologies that multiple research institutions were independently approaching. Eclipse Trust had infiltrated those institutions through funding, through strategic hiring, through board positions, and was slowing development timelines while working to establish safety frameworks that public governments were moving too slowly to create. Ryan's question: who gave you the right to decide when humanity is ready for AI? What if you're wrong and delaying these technologies costs lives that AI could save? Marcus Thompson's response: we're absolutely not certain we're making the right call, but the consensus among the world's top AI safety researchers, including several we consult confidentially, is that current development is racing ahead of safety precautions. We're not stopping AI development, just pumping the brakes while trying to build guardrails. If we're wrong, we'll have delayed beneficial technologies by a few years. If we're right, we'll have prevented potential existential catastrophes. Project Mercury involved influencing the outcome of elections in 3 countries, not through vote manipulation or propaganda, but through strategic economic interventions that created conditions favoring moderate candidates over extremists who would destabilize regions. Eclipse Trust had orchestrated targeted investments, strategic aid distributions, and economic policy recommendations that shifted electoral landscapes without directly tampering with democratic processes. Ryan's question, delivered with barely controlled anger: you're literally subverting democracy while claiming to protect it. How is influencing elections through economic manipulation any better than rigging votes? Jennifer, Zhao's response, equally intense, because one extremist faction in these countries is explicitly calling for ethnic cleansing, and another is pursuing policies that would trigger regional wars. We're not trying to install our preferred candidates. We're trying to prevent genocides and conflicts. If moderate candidates win fairly in environments we helped create, is that better or worse than standing aside while extremists gain power through legitimate democratic means and then implement policies that kill millions? The debate continued through project after project, biotechnology developments that Eclipse was monitoring and occasionally sabotaging when they approached dangerous applications. Resource conflicts. Eclipse was managing through strategic investments that made cooperation more profitable than warfare. Quantum computing advances. Eclipse was both accelerating and constraining depending on specific applications. Every project involved impossible choices between competing ethical frameworks. Every intervention prevented some harm while potentially creating other problems. Every decision required making judgments about what humanity was ready for, what risks were acceptable, what outcomes justified, what methods. Ryan felt his head spinning with the complexity, but he also felt something else. Recognition that these were exactly the kinds of problems he'd been grappling with for 3 years, managing cross-holdings, just scaled larger and with more severe consequences. Should Crown Tower prioritize profits or affordable housing? That was an easy question compared to whether to crash pharmaceutical company stock to prevent dangerous technology release, but it was fundamentally the same question. How do you balance competing goods when every choice has costs? Should Ryan have evicted Derek for lease violations or shown mercy? That was simple compared to whether to influence foreign elections to prevent genocide. But again, the underlying question was the same. When do you use power you have to prevent outcomes you believe are wrong? And when do you accept that other people have the right to make their own mistakes, even if those mistakes harm them? His mother had spent 3 years training him on smaller-scale questions, real estate decisions affecting thousands, before revealing Eclipse Trust's larger-scale questions affecting millions or billions. The manipulation was still wrong, Ryan thought, but the method was becoming clearer. Enough, Ryan said finally, after the 4th hour of presentations. I understand what you do. I still don't accept that any organization should have this much unaccountable power, but I understand why you believe the work matters. Do you? Dr. Sterling asked, and her expression suggested genuine curiosity rather than rhetorical challenge. Do you understand why your mother devoted 40 years to this work, despite the toll it took on her, on you, on her relationships and happiness? Ryan thought about the photographs of his mother looking exhausted in government facilities, meeting with people who wielded enormous power, carrying burdens that would crush most people. He thought about her journal entries agonizing over every decision that caused him pain. He thought about her living modestly while controlling billions because she'd chosen purpose over comfort. She believed someone needed to do this work, Ryan said slowly, working through thoughts as he spoke them. She believed democratic governments moved too slowly to address certain threats, and she believed people with resources and abilities had responsibility to use them, preventing catastrophes, even when doing so required operating outside normal accountability systems. Do you agree with that belief? Patricia Washington asked. Ryan was quiet for a long time, and the board waited, giving him space to think rather than rushing his answer. Finally, he spoke carefully. I agree that certain problems require faster responses than democratic systems can provide. I agree that people with resources have responsibilities beyond just accumulating more wealth. But I don't agree that a small group of people, no matter how well-intentioned, should have this much power without any oversight or democratic accountability. Then reform us, David O'Brien said bluntly. Join the board and change how we operate. Your mother wanted you here specifically because you'd push back against our methods, because you'd force us to justify every intervention, because you'd be the internal voice arguing for restraint and democratic principles. We need that voice, Ryan. Without it, we risk becoming exactly what you fear. Authoritarian manipulators convinced our superior wisdom justifies anything. What happens if I say no? Ryan asked. What happens to Eclipse Trust? We continue as we are, Dr. Sterling replied, with 6 board members instead of 7, which makes certain decisions more difficult, but not impossible. The $47 billion your mother allocated to you reverts to charitable distribution, and we find another candidate eventually. someone else who might have the qualities we need, though we'd prefer to honor your mother's choice by having you." Ryan stood, needing to move, to think without 7 pairs of eyes watching him. He walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan, watching millions of lights representing millions of people, living lives completely unaware that organizations like Eclipse Trust existed, making decisions that shaped their futures without their knowledge or consent. It was arrogant, Ryan thought, deeply, fundamentally arrogant to believe 7 people should make decisions affecting billions. But it was also potentially necessary, or at least defensible, if those decisions prevented genuine catastrophes that democratic systems move too slowly to address. The question wasn't whether Eclipse Trust should exist. It existed whether Ryan joined or not. The question was whether Eclipse Trust would be better or worse with Ryan's participation, bringing his skepticism, his democratic principles, his insistence on ethical constraints, even when those constraints made interventions more difficult. "I need conditions," Ryan said, turning back to face the board. "If I join, I need you to agree to reforms that make Eclipse more accountable, more transparent internally, and more democratic in decision-making, even if we can't be democratic publicly." "Such as?" Dr. Sterling asked, and her expression suggested she'd been expecting exactly this. Ryan outlined his requirements: mandatory ethics reviews for all major interventions, conducted by independent consultants who weren't Eclipse members, term limits for all board positions, including rotating the director role so no one person held too much power for too long, a requirement that any coercive action, anything involving force, deliberate economic harm to innocents, or direct interference with democratic processes, required unanimous board consent with anyone able to veto. And most controversially, a commitment to wind down Eclipse Trust over the next 20 years, training democratic institutions to handle the work Eclipse currently did, while gradually transferring power back to public systems. The board members looked at each other, and Ryan saw disagreement in their expressions. Some of his proposals clearly made them uncomfortable, but others seemed to resonate. "That's a lot to ask," Marcus Thompson said carefully. "Some of your proposals would significantly constrain our operational flexibility." "Good," Ryan replied firmly. "You should be constrained. Power without constraints is tyranny, regardless of intentions. If you want my participation, you accept that I'm going to be the annoying voice, insisting we justify every intervention and constantly asking whether we have the right to do what we're doing." "Your mother said you'd be like this," Jennifer Zhao said, with something that might have been pride. "She predicted you'd join only if you could reform us, would participate only if you could challenge our assumptions. She wanted that, Ryan. She built Eclipse Trust but recognized its dangers, and she wanted someone on the board who'd prioritize checking our power over exercising it." Ryan looked at each board member, reading their expressions, trying to decide if this was genuine openness to reform or manipulation designed to secure his participation. He genuinely couldn't tell, which perhaps was the point. These people were extraordinarily skilled at influence and persuasion, and trusting them required a leap of faith. 3 months trial period, Ryan said finally. "I'll attend meetings, review operations, participate in discussions, but I won't vote on any interventions until I've had time to fully evaluate Eclipse Trust's work and decide whether I can ethically participate. During that time, you implement at least 2 of my reform proposals as good faith demonstration that you're serious about change. If I don't see genuine commitment to accountability after 3 months, I walk away and you never contact me again." Dr. Sterling extended her hand. "Agreed. Welcome to Eclipse Trust, Ryan. Your mother would be proud that you negotiated terms rather than accepting uncritically." Ryan shook her hand. but he felt more trepidation than pride. He'd just agreed to join a shadow organization that manipulated global systems, and while he'd insisted on constraints, he had no guarantee those constraints would be respected once he was committed. But he'd also created an opportunity to reform something that existed, regardless of his participation, to bring democratic principles and ethical scrutiny to work that his mother had believed mattered desperately. Whether that made him a reformer or a collaborator in systems he should have denounced, that question would haunt him for years to come. Epilogue: 3 years forward, 6 years total. 3 years after joining Eclipse Trust's board, Ryan Mitchell stood in the basement command center of his childhood home, but now he used the space regularly rather than discovering it with shock and horror. The reforms he'd demanded had been implemented, partially. Ethics reviews were now standard for major interventions, but Ryan had learned that ethics consultants could be persuaded when billions of dollars and institutional pressure pointed in specific directions. Term limits existed, but the definitions of terms were flexible enough to allow experienced members to continue in modified roles indefinitely. The unanimous consent requirement for coercive action had proven most effective, and Ryan had vetoed 3 operations he'd considered too manipulative, forcing the board to find alternative approaches or accept that certain interventions wouldn't happen. The plan to wind down Eclipse Trust over 20 years remained aspirational but increasingly difficult to implement as new crises emerged requiring exactly the kind of rapid, unaccountable interventions Eclipse specialized in: climate disruption, technological acceleration, geopolitical instability. Every year brought new situations where democratic systems moved too slowly, and Eclipse Trust's shadow interventions prevented catastrophes that billions never knew they'd barely avoided. Ryan had learned to live with moral ambiguity, to make impossible choices where every option had costs, to accept that sometimes preventing one catastrophe required creating smaller problems elsewhere. It was exhausting, disturbing, occasionally nauseating work, but it was also work that mattered in ways few things did. His relationship with Elena had survived the Eclipse revelation. Barely. She'd been furious when Ryan finally explained what he'd joined, but she'd also recognized that someone with Ryan's principles influencing Eclipse decisions was better than Ryan walking away and leaving the organization to operate without his ethical constraints. They'd married quietly, and Elena had become Ryan's conscience, the voice outside Eclipse reminding him when his justifications started sounding too similar to the rationalizations he'd once condemned. Victoria and Derek's lives had followed trajectories Ryan had stopped monitoring closely, though he received occasional updates. Derek's partnership had collapsed under pressures Ryan hadn't created, but hadn't prevented either. Legal ethics violations, client complaints, professional misconduct that suggested Derek's character defects had manifested in his career as predictably as they'd manifested in his personal relationships. Victoria's startup had failed after her mysterious investors withdrew funding for reasons Ryan didn't inquire about too closely. Though he suspected Eclipse Trust connections, he could have helped them, could have used his influence to ease their struggles, could have demonstrated the mercy and forgiveness he'd claimed to embody. But he'd chosen not to, which made him question whether he'd truly forgiven them or just stopped caring enough to maintain resentment. Indifference felt like a type of mercy, but also like a failure of the principles he claimed guided his decisions. The person Ryan thought about most often was his mother. Understanding what she'd done, the manipulation, the testing, the sacrifice, had become more complicated as Ryan experienced similar pressures, making Eclipse Trust decisions. How many times had he made choices that served larger purposes while harming individuals? How many interventions had he supported that violated democratic principles for outcomes he believed prevented greater harms? His mother had been both monster and hero, manipulator and guardian, loving parent and ruthless strategist. Ryan was becoming the same kind of contradictory figure, making decisions that kept him awake at night, while also believing, hoping, that those decisions prevented outcomes worse than the methods required to prevent them. The letter Ryan was currently writing to Elena, to be opened only if he died, echoed his mother's letters to him, apologies for choices that required secrecy, explanations for decisions that would seem inexplicable, requests for understanding about work that violated values he publicly claimed to hold. My dearest Elena, if you're reading this, I'm gone and you're discovering Eclipse Trust's work from documentation rather than my explanation. I'm sorry for the secrets, for the compartmentalization, for treating you as separate from work that consumed so much of my life and conscience. Ryan stopped writing, recognizing the parallels too clearly. He was becoming his mother, brilliant, strategic, effective at preventing catastrophes, but also isolated, secretive, carrying burdens alone rather than sharing them fully even with people he loved. Was that evolution or corruption? Had Eclipse Trust reformed him into someone capable of wielding power responsibly, or had it corrupted him into someone who rationalized violations of principles he'd once held sacred? Ryan didn't have answers, but he had responsibilities. A board meeting tomorrow where they'd discuss interventions in 3 countries, decisions about technologies approaching dangerous applications, choices about which crises to prevent and which to allow to unfold naturally. His phone buzzed with a message from Dr. Sterling. Victoria Reeves has requested a meeting with Eclipse Trust Board. She claims to have information about competitors attempting to build similar shadow organizations. Recommend preliminary vetting before deciding whether to meet. Your thoughts? Ryan stared at the message, considering implications. Victoria knew about Eclipse Trust now, whether through investigation, through Derek's legal connections, or through some other channel Ryan hadn't identified. She had information that might matter to Eclipse operations, and she was requesting a meeting that could go in dozens of directions, from genuine intelligence sharing to attempted manipulation, to revenge for circumstances Ryan had or hadn't influenced. This was the work now, constant evaluation of threats and opportunities, strategic decisions about who to trust and how much to engage, choices between transparency and secrecy, between mercy and strategic calculation. Ryan typed his response, schedule preliminary vetting. If information checks out and her motivations seem genuine, I'll meet with her personally. Might be time to address past situations directly rather than letting them fester. He sent the message and stood, looking at the photographs of his mother on the wall. Young and idealistic in early pictures, older and weighted with experience in later ones, but always carrying herself with purpose that transcended comfort or happiness. Did I make the right choice, Mom? Ryan asked the photographs, continuing the one-sided conversations he'd been having for 6 years. Am I reforming Eclipse Trust from within like I claimed, or am I just becoming what I once condemned? Am I your successor or your victim? Am I wielding power responsibly or rationalizing corruption? The photographs offered no answers, but Ryan heard his mother's voice in memory. The question matters more than the answer, sweetheart. People who stop questioning their own power become tyrants. People who constantly evaluate their authority, who agonize over decisions, who accept that they might be wrong. Those people sometimes do terrible things for complex reasons, but they're less likely to become the monsters that unchecked power usually creates. Ryan left the command center and returned upstairs, where Elena was waiting with coffee and concern, reading his expression accurately despite his best efforts to mask the weight he carried. Bad day? She asked gently. Complex day, Ryan corrected. Victoria wants to meet with the board. She Apparently has intelligence about Eclipse competitors? Elena's expression shifted through surprise to calculation to something Ryan couldn't quite read. After everything she did to you, everything that happened between you, you're going to meet with her. If her information is legitimate, yes, personal history doesn't outweigh professional necessity. Listen to yourself, Elena said quietly. Personal history doesn't outweigh professional necessity. You sound exactly like the kind of person you used to criticize for prioritizing systems over people, for treating relationships as transactional, for justifying anything in service of larger purposes. Ryan sat down heavily, accepting the coffee but also accepting Elena's criticism. I know, I hear myself making the same arguments my mother made, using the same justifications I once condemned. But I also know that if I don't make these decisions, someone else will make them worse. Isn't that worth something? Maybe, Elena replied. Or maybe that's just how corruption works. Slowly, through compromises that each seem defensible individually, but cumulatively transform you into someone unrecognizable. I married a librarian with principles, Ryan. I'm watching you become something else, and I'm not sure whether to be proud or terrified. Ryan had no answer that would satisfy either of them, so instead he pulled Elena close, holding her in silence while Manhattan glittered outside their window. And somewhere across the city, Victoria Reeves prepared for a meeting that would test whether Ryan's principles had survived his transformation or whether Eclipse Trust had corrupted him completely. The test was never-ending, Ryan understood now. His mother had lived with these questions for 40 years. He'd inherited not just her wealth and her work, but her perpetual uncertainty about whether the power she wielded was being used wisely or merely rationalized effectively. The only difference was that Ryan had chosen this burden with full knowledge of what it would cost, while his mother had manipulated him into readiness without his consent. That made his participation less innocent, but perhaps more genuine. He couldn't claim he'd been tricked or forced. He'd walked into Eclipse Trust with his eyes open, accepted power knowing its dangers, and now carried consequences that would define him for whatever years remained. Whether that made him a hero, a villain, or something more complicated than those simple categories allowed, that was a question Ryan would spend the rest of his life attempting to answer, just as his mother had before him. The shadow legacy continued, passed from mother to son, corrupting or ennobling or both simultaneously, preventing catastrophes while creating moral compromises, saving millions while violating the autonomy of individuals operating in darkness to protect light. Ryan Mitchell, former librarian and current guardian of systems billions didn't know existed, carried his mother's burden forward into an uncertain future, questioning every decision while making them anyway, accepting that perfect ethics were impossible while refusing to stop pursuing them, becoming his mother's successor in all the beautiful and terrible ways that inheritance implied.